You're about to listen to the Yet Another Value podcast with your host, me, Andrew Walker. Today's episode is this is a follow-up to the podcast I did with Artem Fokin, my friend, on perfecting the investment process. This is a webinar that we did on AlphaSense. We talk a lot about using AI and expert calls in the research process, using them for improvement, all that sort of stuff. This was behind a paywall for AlphaSense, but they said after a month, hey, we're getting good reviews. Why don't you put it out on the podcast and try and get more listenership? And we want this to be out there. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. I hope you do. I'll include a link to the prior Perfecting the Investment Process podcast with Artem in the show notes, which was to be frank, one of the most popular podcasts I've ever done. We got tons of great feedback on it. So I think you're really going to like that podcast. I think you'll really enjoy this podcast if you like that podcast. So we're going to get all there in a second. But first, a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is sponsored by AlphaSense. Look, over the years, you've heard me talk about it nonstop. AlphaSense, Tegas, they've become core to how I do investment research. They've got a burgeoning set of AI tools. They've got the expert calls, which I absolutely love, the expert call library. They've got as they tell me, over 500 million premium sources from company filings, broker reports, news, trade journals, everything, plus the expert calls. They put it all in one place. Their AI tools let you search unique data sources in really interesting ways. This October, they're hosting their first ever Alpha Summit 2025 in Brooklyn. I'll be dropping in and out. So the event will feature all sorts of leaders from finance, UBS, Wells Fargo, Accenture, Google, who's who are going to be there, sharing how AI is reshaping the investment research and decision-making landscape. What's going to make AlphaSense special is it's just not just about the ideas. It's about really talking about how AI can improve workflows and the strategies that top firms are using right now. So I'd love to see you there. If you're going, you can join me there, Alpha Summit 2025, October 6th through 8th at the Refinery at the Domino. You can sign up at alphasense.com/YAVP. That's alpha-sense.com/YAVP. All right, hello, and welcome to the, I guess it's just the AlphaSense user webinar with me, Andrew Walker, the host of the Yet Another Value podcast, and my good friend, Artem Fokin. He is the head of Caro-Kann Capital. Artem, how's it going?
Hi, Andrew. Great seeing you again.
Look, Artem, let's just start. Disclaimer, nothing on this webinar is investing advice. I don't think we're talking specific stocks, but we might dive into some real-time examples. So people should remember that. And I'm sure AlphaSense will do disclaimers out the wazoo. Look, I'll set the stage and then we can dive into everything. We were talking to the people at AlphaSense. So we are both users, subscribers, whatever you want to call it. I think we both find huge amounts of value from the product. I think we find huge amounts of value in different pieces of the product. AlphaSense and Tegas are they've got everything at this point, but we said it and they said, hey, why don't you guys come on and do a webinar talking about, we just did a podcast talking about, I don't think it was quite process improvement, but our process as investors. And a lot of that, for me personally, a lot of the process improvements for me over the past 10 years has been adopting AI into my investing process and adopting expert calls into my investing process. I was already doing a little, but both have ramped up, and both of them have ramped up materially in large part thanks to Tegas AlphaSense and the tools and the expert call library network and everything. So we told them about that, all that sort of stuff, and they're like, hey, why don't you guys get on? Talk about using AI in your process, talking about using expert calls in your process, talk about how you use AlphaSense in your expert process. So that's the overall idea for this webinar, an hour of us talking about all of that. Would you add anything to that or anything else people should feel like they're going to get from this hour of the webinar?
I think the theme of both our prior conversation on Yet Another Value podcast and today's webinar is the same theme: improving and perfecting our craft as investors. So I stand behind that. Obviously, when you and I were talking on the public, so to speak, podcast, we were speaking more broad themes as opposed to concrete specific tools of the trade. We were talking about how to use a hammer to hit on a nail or whatever other tool you may be using. Here, we will probably be talking a little bit more about, okay, how do you choose a hammer or any other tool? Or how do you use it and how you're changing your use cases? So I think probably this conversation are more likely to be more specific. So I'll be sharing some of my examples and use cases. You may throw some of yours. So I'm really looking forward. But the theme is, I think it is the same.
I think you're exactly correct. And I think the way we're going to structure this is we're going to talk about using expert calls, using AI, and then as we continue that, dive deeper and deeper and narrow into how, if people are listening to this and are subscribed to AlphaSense and Tegas, how they can use specific AlphaSense and Tegas tools to in their process as we dive deeper and deeper. So let me just start off. I made a contention in there that I'd love for you to push back on, agree with, disagree with. Over the past 10 years, I think the biggest change and improvement in my process has been, when I was at McKinsey or when I was at Bain Capital, we would do expert calls all the time. But when you switch from a place kind of with approaching unlimited resources to being, let's just call it more individual investor, small solo practitioner, whatever it is, you lost that access to, hey, I want to learn this company. I'm going to go do 20 expert calls and spend $1,000 an expert call, or you didn't have 15 analysts to go summarize everything that's ever been written in a research report. I think the biggest process improvement has been expert call libraries, so you can get access to basically unlimited amounts of expert calls for an annual subscription. That's new over the past 10 years. And then AI, it can summarize 20 earnings reports, so you don't need 10 analysts under you to kind of get summaries of big earnings report. Would you agree with that contention? Would you disagree? Have you kind of thought about those just two overall process improvements over the past 10 years?
I wouldn't necessarily call them process improvements per se.
I keep using that term and you keep pushing back on me.
I would call them disruptive innovation that came to the investment research space. And in terms of tools that I use, those, meaning expert call libraries and bespoke expert calls, because the price dropped dramatically, as you pointed out, with the advent of Tegus and Stream, Mosaic, AlphaSense. Again, I will use the AlphaSense and Tegus interchangeably because now it's under the same umbrella and we don't need to trace exact corporate history. Those lower the costs. And the library, again, technological innovation, network effect that was built by connecting creators and readers. And by the way, you can be both creator and reader at the same time. That usually expands the total addressable market and lowers the cost because of that. You convert a pure variable cost model into semi-fixed, semi-variable. That would lead to the expansion of entire TAM and usage of expert calls, in my opinion. I haven't seen the data, obviously, but that's my guess. And I think I'm fairly confident that I'm right about that. So those were two disruptive innovations. People may bring in some credit card data or alternative data that are still very, 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 very expensive. We don't use that much of credit card. We don't use credit card data, and our alternative data is pretty simple, such as Google Trends. By the way, AlphaSense, maybe you figure out how to build something and lower the cost in that vertical as well. But for me personally, expert call libraries and advent of AI were two biggest disruptive innovation in the environment that I've been implementing into my process.
I agree. Let's dive into expert calls. So the reason I want to start, I think AI is a little buzzier, and I think AI, like everyone should be experienced with AI tools. But I want to start with expert calls because I think they're a tool that bluntly wielded can be useful, but I think the finer you kind of sharpen that sword, I think that it's like a force multiplier in terms of the effectiveness of expert calls. And I mean that both for reading expert call libraries, reading expert call transcripts, but especially for conducting expert interviews. I know you and I have done some together before. I've been on calls with other people. When I'm on an expert call with someone who's really good versus someone who's really good, someone who's super prepared versus someone who might be doing it by the seat of the pants, I'm just always impressed by how much more I learn and everything. So I just want to stop there. How do you use expert calls? And then we can start diving into the different ways to use them and everything.
Okay, so as a joke, most of my time I spent either listening or reading. So, and if you use these two modalities, unsurprisingly, these are two use cases for expert calls. I either listen, meaning I conduct a bespoke expert call, or I read a certain number of calls that are already in the library. And that number can, if there are already a lot of calls, the number what I am reading can vary from just a few, because maybe there are not that many. And I think the record one was probably 70 calls across Tegus and AlphaSense that I've read, and I did probably 5 or 6 of my own as well. And I literally read 70 calls. Since then, the number has only gone up. Now it's probably up to 100 or so. And I literally read all of them. And that was a lot of fun because the business was sufficiently complex. And by the way, I could mention the business to put things in perspective. It's an IWG, the hybrid working flex space provider. that does operations globally. Full disclaimer, Caro-Kann Capital, LLC, and all its affiliates are own the shares of IWG. This is not investment advice or recommendation to buy or sell any securities. So I'm just giving it for context. The business is complex and had a long history and a lot of evolution and lots of moving pieces. So my first thinking was, I'll do 5 expert calls and I'll figure this out. Did 5 bespoke expert calls, did not figure anything out. Back to square one. I'm like, okay, I guess I need to read these 70 calls. And then I methodically read all of them, but both on IWG and WeWork, because it's a very close P. And when you study the industry, you want to study several players if they exist. And that was incredibly educational for me and informative. And now many things that come up, I'm like, yeah, I know the answer. I've read this call and someone in the industry or a client mentioned this. It was mentioned 2 or 3 years ago, but there is same rationale that's applicable today. So I love reading those things. And I also love doing my own. In fact, what often excites me when I research a company is when I log in into AlphaSense, I put the ticker, and I choose that I want to get search results only for expert calls, and it shows 0 calls or 1 or 2 calls. It means that probably nobody really looked at it. And that's, for me, is an opportunity to learn more about this company that I perceive as an interesting investment opportunity and deepen my research tremendously compared to probably what is out there.
A lot of questions, but let me start with one, just like sourcing of experts. So I run the Yet Another Value podcast. And one thing I've started doing recently is I've actually started trying to do an expert call on every company before I do the podcast on the company. You know, it's an idea-focused podcast for those who haven't listened. 1 hour long. You can listen to it. You cannot. It doesn't matter. But I've started trying to do an expert call on every company before I do the podcast, so that I have more informed questions, more interesting insights, all that sort of stuff. But one thing that's jumped out to me is like, you know, some podcasts, it's so obvious who I want to do the expert call on. You know, you're doing a company that has 80% customer. Guess what? I want to talk to somebody who works at the 80% customer and get their insights into the company. You know, you're doing a company that's got a new drug. I want to talk to a doctor who's prescribing the drug. Ask them how they're viewing it. Ask them how they're seeing. Some companies, you know, I would use as a very loose example. If I was going to do an expert call on Berkshire Hathaway, what the heck expert call would I do, right? It's this conglomerate that is basically Warren Buffett, and like a former wouldn't really help. Charlie Munger, I mean, rest in peace, but he wouldn't even talk to me. But like, I wouldn't do a former. It's really a culture and I say that because Constellation Software, like what that is a roll up of software businesses focused on municipal governments, if I remember their core focus correctly. What am I going to do with Constellation Software if I'm going to talk to an expert? Like, it's literally 100 different small companies rolled up together. There are several other ones, but I struggle with that. So when do you know if an expert call works for a company, works for an investment thesis versus maybe doesn't, like the Berkshire Hathaway example?
Okay, great question. Before I answer that, let me just clarify something that what you probably meant to say. I think you were saying that if a company has a very large customer, you may want to talk to the customer. I think what you meant to say is that you want to talk to a former employee of that very large customer.
Yes, you are exactly
because from a compliance perspective, talking to a big customer is not prudent or smart.
You are right. The cheapest compliance people will hop on and
grab us. And I want to be very clear. AlphaSense has fantastic compliance team who is very thoughtful, very diligent, conservative in a good way, conservative, and they would not source an expert which could present a compliance or legal issue. So in Andrew's example, the right way to go about it would be find someone who left that customer a year ago.
Yes.
Who may understand the product, understand the process, understand the relationship, but that person has no information that may restrict the investor.
Yes.
So, and then again, AlphaSense team, fantastic on that sense. And by the way, that's another great thing about using AlphaSense call expert library or asking to organize calls by AlphaSense. There is a record that has been reviewed by a compliance team, and you know that you're clear, you're good. That's another, again, it's not what you asked, but it was very pertinent point to make right now. Okay, going back to the heart of your question is sourcing expert calls. Remember our conversation about golf and different cups
Yes.
yesterday? So you need to use a different, and by the way, for those who didn't listen to our prior conversation, I do not play golf, unfortunately. So, but the analogy which I used yesterday was that for different situations, you use different tools. Similar in golf, for different terrain, you use different cups. Otherwise, you're not going to do well at golf. So here's the same. This is how I approach it. Usually, you figure out the key ingredients for success of your investment thesis. For example, if your idea is based on product superiority that the company has launched 6 months ago, and you believe that this product is massively superior to everything else out there, maybe it's safer, maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's more efficient. You know, people in Silicon Valley like to say like, oh, this is 10x better or 10x cheaper. Now, 10x is a more of a figurative way to describe that. It may not necessarily be 10x better, but it should be better, very substantial. In that case, you need to focus, I would want to focus all my research efforts on that product and understand customer perspective, both people who already using that superior product, people who switched, people who have not switched but tried, and people who didn't even bother learn out about that product and understand what's stopping them. That's one example. Another example, there may be a thesis which is based, okay, product is fantastic. I got comfortable with that. In business, there are two problems, as my Stanford Business School professor joked. Do you know those problems?
No,
Problem number one, not enough sales. Problem number two, everything else. Okay, so you got the product. Can the company sell tons of that product or service? Do they have a well-established sales motion, an incredibly running sales machine, or not? Guess what? In that case, I will want to talk to former salespeople. What's the sales processes like? There is another company that Caro-Kann Capital LLC and or its affiliates own called SoftWave. SoftWave Medical listed in Israel. Again, this is not investment advice. So, in my opinion, based on my research, they have superior product, and you can ask me later how I got to that conclusion and why it's superior, etc., etc. But I also wanted to understand the sales process. So AlphaSense helped me source a former salesperson, and I spoke with him for an hour, and I literally asked him, could you role play with me your conversation? Imagine I'm a doctor, dermatologist. You came to my office. We shake hands, and I ask you why you're here. Why you're taking my time away from my schedule and from my patients. Let's go through that. And we literally borderline did the role play probably for 20 minutes overall over the course of an entire hour. And then I was asking different other questions. That's incredibly helpful to understand how the sales happen. Because sometimes it's very easy when you are in our Excel or Notion or Microsoft Word, whatever we use, it's very easy to think that sales just happen. But sales just don't happen. Someone needs to sell it. Like everything which is in my office here has been somehow sold to me. So, and I think understanding sales process is one of the most incredible things. Like overall, I believe that if someone, by the way, like so I'm in my early 40s. If I look back of my life, I wish I spent 6 months in sales in something, ideally B2B, just to understand the process and psychological challenges of that and how it works. I think it would have made me a better investor. Now, I'm in my early 40s. I'm not going to go back and get the job, but the best I can do is either talk to people who are in sales and learn from them, or read expert call libraries about sales process and how it works.
You know, so I'm going to keep, I think you will know the company I'm talking about. I'm going to keep it anonymized intentionally, but one really interesting example I've seen recently is there's a company and they have an FDA approved study that says their, let's just call it device defective rate is 1%. And all of their FDA, all of their peers are last generation products, and it's 10%. So when you see that, you would say, oh my God, this product is literally 10x better. You chose 10x, it's 10x, and these defects they're pretty bad. It's it's an implant device. If you have a defect, there's another surgery at minimum required, right? So you read that and you say, oh my God, this is a 10x better product. And it's so interesting when you do expert calls on this company, when you talk to salespeople about how they're selling it to people using that, hey, this product is 10x better. Do you really want to take the medical malpractice risk of putting a different product in when this product's 10% better, versus when you talk to doctors and then you hear doctors and you say, hey, I'm reading an FDA study that says this product is 1% defect rate versus other last gen products at 10%. Why are you still using a 10% last gen product? And they say, hey, the last gen products all of the FDA studies were done in the 90s. Guess what? There have been huge process improvements and huge improvements in surgical techniques since then. We think that the last gen products are just as safe as the current gen products, and we've got our own evidence and our surgery specs up. So it's really interesting. You hear the company spin, and then you can use the expert calls to dive in and hear how the sales force is using it. And maybe if the customer, in this case, the surgeons, are buying it or not buying it. I have more questions on expert calls, but I think that's a really interesting anonymized example I tried to give. I'll pause there and let you just comment on any piece, or if that reminds you of an investment you've made.
That. Again, on a company that we own, and it has FDA clearances. It's very interesting. I asked probably 6, 7, 8 doctors, and I asked them. So again, I'm talking about SoftWave here, right? I'm still talking about SoftWave. We still own the shares. Nothing changed in the last 5 minutes. So they have almost 10. I believe it's number 9. So let's round it to 10 for the sake of simplicity. FDA clearances for various indications. And as far as I understand, based on my research and conversations via AlphaSense, almost nobody else has as many. So I then ask doctors, doctor, SoftWave has this number of FDA clearances, and that device doesn't, or has only 1 or 2. Do you, doctor, care? And interestingly, I receive a fairly broad range of responses. Some people care a lot, because they say my liability if something goes down is a lot lower, the risk of that, because I was using an FDA-cleared device for an indication that was clear. For me, it gives me more comfort. I like that. On the other extreme, and I will skip all the shades between those 2 extremes, someone may say, I don't really care. I'm really good at what I do. I can use it off-label. I'm super confident. Doctor, I don't care. For me, it's just a marketing buzz. I don't care. That's a range of opinions. And that's, again, something that I've gotten more comfortable as over the years, as I've done many expert calls, is that sometimes there will be no one answer, because different customers may have different opinions, and that's okay. Because probably I was obviously less experienced back then, and I was in general and less experienced in conducting expert calls. You go and you expect, like, you'll ask a question, and every single doctor in our example will give you the same answer.
Yes.
Like, great, I got it. It's certain. Nothing is certain. Different people have different opinions, and that's okay. But it's incredibly helpful to understand the broad range of opinions and incorporate them into your thinking about the investment thesis, whatever that thesis is.
Let me go back. So you mentioned when you were talking about SoftWave, talking to a former salesperson. And formers are actually the discussions I have the hardest time with, because most formers, by definition, have left the company. And I find that they can have...
I think it's not almost. I think it's everybody left the company. Otherwise, they're not former.
By definition. That's why I said by definition, they've left the company. Most of the time, the formers leave, not most, I don't know if it's most time, but a lot of the formers I talk to have left through a layoff, especially now, on the heels of the 2022, like kind of all the growth stocks going through a round of cost cutting, a round of fat trimming. A lot of the formers left through layoffs. And I find sometimes it is hard to cut through the bitterness of having left from a layoff versus how the customers actually treated it. Or sometimes the person loved being at the place, where it was wildly successful, left, and they've got nothing to say but great things about the company. And then you look and like the company is kind of going up in flames, and you're like, oh, well, it's hard to marry them. So I want to ask, like, how do you kind of separate the bias of a former, whether it's positive or negative, versus what you're learning in the call? Because I just find they can be such double-edged swords when you talk to them.
It's difficult. Let me ask you this before I answer the question. As far as I know, you're married. I know your
Yes.
wife's name. I think you mentioned it publicly, so I will say her name is Alicia. It's okay, fantastic. Have you had girlfriends before you married?
Artem, are you trying to get me in trouble here, bro?
No, I'm not. I hope that Alicia
I might have had one or two.
Okay, so I'm hoping that if someone calls them and asks, is Andrew a good human being? They will probably say that you're a good human being, even though you're not together anymore. So I think formers is a little bit the same. And by the way, formers may be formers for a variety of reasons. Not all of them got laid off. Some of them got a better career option.
Yes.
They accepted the offer, they moved on. There is not much bitter feelings in that case. There will be some formers. But where I'm leading with my question about your dating history, Alicia, I'm really sorry. I hope I will not get Andrew into trouble. So I think how the company would treat a former employee if that employee was dismissed, whether fired or laid off, doesn't really matter. It also tells you a lot about the company culture. I think one of the best indicators about indirect evidence about culture that I've had with formers is when a person will honestly tell me there was a round of layoffs. Unfortunately, I was let go. I think it's a great company. It's unfortunate. And then you ask them if they call you tomorrow and say, hey, business is doing better. We need more people. We loved you. We're sorry that you had to leave. Would you like to come back? And many people say, oh, yeah. Some people say no. Some people say yes. That's a telling sign. Similarly, would you recommend your brother or sister or a nephew or a niece to work there? It tells you something about the culture. Now, it's only one piece of evidence. And again, you and I spoke about this yesterday. We are in the business of making judgment and decisions. So similarly, in this case, when we talk to any expert, we need to make a judgment about their credibility. And it's not always easy. Often it's difficult. You know what I was doing before I went to business school, right? In my prior professional life.
Yes.
Okay, what I was doing before that?
You were a tax lawyer.
Yeah, I was a lawyer, right? So now, in law, there is this concept of preponderance of evidence. So and some of those frameworks from my legal days, I think I still use them as mental frameworks in my investing. So I think preponderance of evidence would be one of those. I cannot establish with certainty that what 10 experts, customers, former employees, industry consultants, whoever, told me is true. I don't know. They may be lying. Possible. They may be telling me the truth, what they believe is truth, but they're simply wrong. It could happen. All of us are human beings. But what you're trying to do, you're trying to build a case that way there is a very high chance, supported by that preponderance of evidence, that this would be a good investment to make based on your thesis.
Can
you ever get to beyond the reasonable doubt, which is the standard in criminal proceedings? Probably not in investing, unfortunately. But could you get at least to preponderance of evidence, kind of more likely than not standard? I think so. That's what we're trying to do.
I like what you said. You're never, like, it would be awesome if we could interview 5,000 formers at every company and like really build out a database and be like, oh, yeah, there were 20 who were upset, but 4,980 didn't. This is a great company. You know, in terms of extremes, right? I've done calls before, and I'm thinking of a specific company with 3 formers, right? And this was a smaller company. So 3 formers is a large percentage of their formers. 2 of them were happy, had good things to say. And one of them, was 1-star review would have been too high, right? It was as little as they could go. This was the worst place in the world. Now, all of these guys had left through layoffs, and I don't know, like the guy who I was interviewing, he was there for 9 months. He might have been surprised by the layoff. It was a pretty miserable experience. But I just wonder, how do you weigh the extremes? Whether it's my example where there's one person who is unbelievably bitter, or sometimes I'll do calls and 3 people are meh, company's fine, wouldn't go back, but no bad words to say, and one person is over the moon. Do you, in investing, extremes are what makes much of an investing career. So do you weigh extremes more, less? How do you think about that?
I need context. I cannot opine in general without reading those transcripts and making a specific judgment call. That's number one. Number two, you also get other data points. For example, this is my frame of reference, which may be incorrect, but I believe that generally, companies with crappy culture and unhappy employees do not make great products. Usually. It means that if I'm seeing that the company has really crappy product and 1 out of 3 employees in your example was unhappy and speaks very negatively with 1-star review will be too generous, I'm more likely to believe the expert testimony, let's use that word, while if the company is shipping great products and has happy customers who are enthusiastic about the product or service, I'm probably less likely to put more weight on the unhappy former employee. And by the way, all of us have this type of experience. A few years ago, I invested, that's not a current position, I invested in a healthcare service company. And healthcare service company, broadly defined, it was more on the dealing with insurance company, let's say. So, and I spoke with a few formers, and one of them was very, very negative. But when you look at his specific lines and what he said, and you match it with management commentary, you match it with what other people are saying, you get to the conclusion that he's probably off base and too emotional and too unhappy, and he's not really supporting it by facts. And then there is another thing which is important, is the art of asking follow-up questions. If someone says like, company culture is horrible, it's horrendous, it's toxic, it's very interesting to hear. I'm so glad you said that. Could you give me an example? And if you get one example, then you ask for another example. You keep digging. Like, think about it. You put that person on the witness stand, and you're trying to get respecting their confidentiality agreements and NDAs and everything else, of course. You try to get what is behind. And if they give you examples that for you seem totally toxic, yeah, maybe there is a problem. If they cannot come up with any tangible things and it's all big words, they probably less credible.
That's great on expert calls. And again, the reason I want to start there is because I mean, at this point, you and I have talked about it, I do an expert call a week. I probably read a transcript a day. Like I find them to be hugely helpful tools. And I just, the more you apply them to investing, just even in terms of if you're following a company, calling a customer, a different customer once a month, once a quarter, whatever it is, and asking them, hey, you're buying this product, what do you think? And obviously within all compliance rules, what do you think? Like, it's just really interesting to continue to build that mosaic. And if people aren't doing it, I think you're getting left behind. And it's one of the few areas where you can build kind of mosaic information that is going to be pretty unique to you. Any last thoughts on expert calls, or can I start switching over to AI?
I have a few ones on expert calls. So first, screening questions. Screening questions alone can be a fantastic source of value.
Yes.
So what I usually do, I always design my own expert calls and ask the team, could you ask these questions? Okay, I never ask anything about the career history, because that will be available in bio. You don't want to waste a screening question on that because you cannot ask 20 of them. You ask like 3 or 4. So that's number one. Number two, I always try to understand what that person was doing day to day. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. Sometimes it's less obvious. So that's what I try to understand. I try to ask questions of two types. It can be either open-ended, and I'm hoping that expert will write 2, 3, 4 sentences. And sometimes you learn a lot from those sentences alone. And some questions I might ask, and this is more applies for when you look for a proverbial needle in a haystack, you ask them, rate me, you give them several areas of business like marketing, sales, so supply chain management, etc., procurement, etc. And then you ask them, rate your knowledge of each of them based on the scale of 1 to 10. And what ideally you want to do, you want to see a lot of 1s and 2s, and 1 or 2, 8, 9, 10. Because it would mean that the expert is honest and not exaggerating their expertise. Because if they show, I can talk about sales and technology and product management and marketing, probably they know nothing unless they will see you. But if they say marketing, sorry, I have no idea. But supply chain management, 9 out of 10, I'm very knowledgeable. I was blah, blah, blah. That was my title I was doing. That's a very different game. So then also, when I read a lot of expert calls, as you and I discussed, and sometimes it's very clear that people who conduct them ask questions that it's very clear almost in advance that the expert will not be able to answer. Like, for example, do not ask salesperson about accounting, or do not discuss with a marketing person why stock-based compensation is so high. They wouldn't know unless they accounting junkie and study accounting textbooks for fun on Saturdays, Sundays. So you need to calibrate that. Now, sometimes I get it. You may have a call for an hour. It's 40 minutes in. You ask all your questions. You kind of realize that expert may be not as good as you hoped, which happens. And then you just, okay, let me ask everything else. It could happen. But sometimes I see like, oh my God, why they asking this? They should have followed up on this. And I'm sure I make my own mistakes. I'm not saying I'm perfect whatsoever. That's a continuous improvement, but that's another common mistake. And then one use case that I wanted to highlight on our prior investment at Caro-Kann Capital, and we don't own shares anymore, is a company called Crocs. The way I joke them, those very interesting looking shoes. So this is the stage. Let me set up the stage. As far as I remember, summer 2022. Crocs is trading probably at 5.5, maybe 6 times earnings for 2022, and it's already let's say June. Okay, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that either the company is going out of business soon in the next few years, or it's horribly mispriced. And what happened, Crocs had tremendous uplift in sales during COVID. And the key question was, is it just another COVID beneficiary and it's all going to collapse? By collapse, I don't mean necessarily stock price. It was already down horrible. I'm talking about fundamental performance. Or whether it's not. How do you figure this out? It's very difficult. And what we did, I spoke with several former employees. And they told, and some of them left even before COVID. But they shared with me all those internal changes that the company has made before COVID. And then COVID probably helped with the whole stay at home and wearing casual trend, sure. But the company built such a fantastic, based on my research, I can be mistaken, foundation that they were able to take advantage of those COVID tailwinds. And that foundation is probably not disappearing. And that was very valuable learning. But again, that was almost a history guide. Look, that's what happened in 17, that what happened in 18. This was the change. We got a new marketing person. We changed this, we changed that, etc., etc. That was an incredible tutorial in the history. It's almost like you're traveling to, I don't know, big France, to see some castles from medieval times, and you get a local guide with a major in history. Guess what? They will tell you a lot of valuable things that you would not discover otherwise. That's the analogy.
That was great. And I actually have follow-on questions, but I want to be cognizant of time on the webinar and everything. And I want to move on to talking about AI. And I'd love to just start, broadly. We can dive into AlphaSense specific tools. And I do want to talk about AlphaSense specific tools since this is an AlphaSense webinar and everything, but just broadly, how have you been incorporating AI into your process? How are you kind of using them? What tools are you using?
Okay, so I think this is where we stopped yesterday. So the way I think about the usage of AI in my investing process is across the line of the framework that I've heard from Paul Enright on one of his podcasts. I believe it was podcast with Patrick O'Shaughnessy on Invest Like the Best. If I'm wrong, then it was in Capital Allocators. So, and he breaks it into digging, analyzing, deciding. And it's very simple. There are 3 stages. It's not, this is the flowchart diagram with 100 boxes. It's pretty simple, but I found it's effective in general, and especially when I think about AI. So I think, and then I break it, where AI for me is delivering most productivity boost. And it's mostly in digging. A little bit in analyzing, so far 0 in deciding. And this is my view as of August 6th, I believe today. So it could change in the future as technology evolves, as I evolve. So that's number 1. Number 2, simplistically, we can break usage of AI into, can you do something with AI that you used to do, but it will save you a lot of time? Versus, can you do something with AI that you were never able to do? I figured out many use cases for the first one. I have not figured out use cases for the second one yet. I hope I will. So on digging, AI provides productivity boost in many ways, and I will walk you through some use cases. And again, as I mentioned yesterday, I feel that AI and expert collaborators were a match made in heaven. So now I can be using AI as a research co-pilot. I'll give you an example. I'm at a company, at a conference in May, the Riley conference, was an interesting group meeting, came away thinking that maybe an interesting company to research. Got back home, a few days later, pull out some VIC write-ups just to get what the thesis has been. I start reading it. The write-up says, this company operates in 10 states. Okay, there are 50 states in the nation. They still have 40 states left, at least based on roughly 2 years ago. But did it change? It has been 2 years. Maybe now they're in 30 or 50 or 60. Well, okay, not 60. 60 would be too much. 50. So, I don't know. In the old days, what I would need to do, I would need to open my Notion file, type there question list, which I have in the template, and type how many states is this company currently operating? And then I will need to go open 10K and look for it, etc., etc. Now what I do, I have my PDF file with VIC write-up or VIC itself on one screen. I have AlphaSense on another. I pull out AI Assistant. I ask, how many states is the company currently operating? Also, could you please provide the history of how the number of states changed over the years and any other relevant information, such as revenue breakdown by state or group of state or whatever? I don't know, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 8 seconds. I get an answer. I quickly read and I know, okay, since then they expanded to this number of states and they got cost states or legacy states. This is where most revenue comes from. And they got new states, but they're still ramping up, etc., etc. You're like, fantastic. I don't need to write this question down anymore and then remember to check 10K and go. So that's my research co-pilot need. I love that.
I'm completely with you just in terms of the use cases of summarizing, or I know I want to go to the I want to go to the past 3 proxies and see how incentive comp has changed over time. And that used to be like, I'm pretty fast, but that used to be a multi-hour process, right? You have to open 3 proxies, scroll through them, really compare, read. Like these companies don't exactly make it easy to see how much they're paying each people and why they're paying them. With any type of AI tool, it's a 10-second process. Hey, how has incentive comp evolved over the past 3 years? Let me ask specifically. So that was just generic AI. I think there's really interesting things about merging AI and expert calls, but I think we can hit on them as we talk about what about AlphaSense specifically? Like they have, especially over the past 6 to 9 months. Let's just talk about how are you using AlphaSense specific tools, because they, over the past 6 months, they've rolled out several and they're going to roll out several more and they're getting much better. So what AlphaSense specific tools are you using?
Okay, so you're right. AlphaSense is shipping a bunch of new features, right? So that's fantastic. Features are getting shipped and shipped and shipped, and there are more and more and more. So now I will tell you the one obviously they have is the chat. And the chat can work in regular chat, or you can turn on deep research mode on the chat if you want something bigger output and you want it to think longer. So that's fairly similar use case to ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever general AI or what I call horizontal AI use. My favorite personal feature of the AlphaSense is what they call grid. And you can make grid almost, it's like a Lego my son plays. You can turn that grid in almost whatever you want. For example, I will give you a few examples that I use. I will give you some examples that I think I would like to use, but haven't done much of it yet because of more of my investment style as opposed to limitations of AlphaSense, because that tool is very powerful. So imagine Andrew calls me and says, Artem, I have this great stock idea. This is the thesis, etc., etc. Okay, I want to understand customer perspective. I go to AlphaSense, and there are 20 expert calls, most of them with customers. I got no clue which one was a good call, which one was an average call. And all of them are pretty long. 20 calls to read, that's a good amount of time. And usually when I read, I also take a lot of notes. And it means that my reading time actually goes up. Figuring out where to focus, and this goes back to digging stage, is very, very important. Now, what I pre-built, and this is important, AlphaSense gives you some templates, you can use them, but I made those templates myself that will fit my investment style and my focus. And I have different templates for grid. I will have templates that is more targeted towards product. Another one will be more targeted towards company strategy, competition, risk, etc. And you can build as many as you want. If you're a software as a service investor, you can build one for SaaS, another one you can build for industrials or for consumer, whatever you like. There's a lot of flexibility there. And grid looks exactly, think about it as a chessboard. There are horizontal lines and there are vertical lines. Horizontal lines, this is documents. By the way, documents can be any, it can be expert calls. This is what I'm using as my example. It can be earnings calls. It can be 10Ks and Qs or proxies in your example, Andrew, and incentive compensation, whatever you like. And then columns will be questions. And I think you can put up to 12 questions. And then you ask those questions and you see what you get in return. And by the way, that's another cool thing about AlphaSense. Okay, I'm not a technologist. So if what I describe is actually incorrect, I apologize in advance. But my understanding is that AlphaSense, because it's a specialized vertical AI tool, it makes the prompting by user less important, less critical to get a good output. Because I think at the back end, they kind of transform your lousy prompt into something a lot more thoughtful. Now, you can still try to be thoughtful, and I try to do that, but that's a big advantage, in my opinion, of using a specialized AI tool versus generic AI tool or general AI tool, such as ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever else. So, and then I got this prompt, and it can be, what's customer value proposition? What made you decide to buy this product? How long was the sales cycle? What other alternatives have you considered? Etc., etc., etc. And then you click it, takes a little bit of time, and then you got this grid with 20 expert calls horizontally and your 12 questions vertically. And then you can read very quickly 20 answers, if they were given, because some of them maybe this did not come up, in one question just by moving in vertical line. You just do that. And then, number one, you got 20 points of view in just a few minutes. Remember, you and I spoke about doctors who may give different opinions about the same issue. Now you got the entire range of opinions within, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it takes for you to read those. And more important, you can repeat this for all your 12 questions. But then I also figure out which expert, or several of them, give the most thoughtful answers.
Yes.
Or alternatively, I can figure out which expert call gives me yellow flags or red flags. In that case, I would go, if I see took, let's say, out of 20 calls, I have 3 with red flags or yellow flags. I would go there. And then I will read those myself from first page up to the last page, including disclaimer and page numbers. And then I may make a decision that given these yellow flags, I'm not comfortable making this investment, so I will kill my research idea. Alternatively, I will figure out 3 or 4 or 5 calls that are the best, and I'll go there. And then I may decide, reading the other 15 not important, or am I still, okay, knowing me, I will still read them, but it would be just to make sure that I didn't miss something, because my thesis already has been confirmed. And that's a massive time boost and efficiency boost driven by AI. And the theme here for me, human, and I think I got this idea from Garry Kasparov, the 13th world champion, chess champion, and he coined it many years ago. And the premise is that human plus machine is more powerful than machine, and definitely more powerful than human. So that's the idea. Now, it may not always be the case. Who knows? We'll do another webinar in 10 years where my avatar will be talking to Andrew's avatar, all powered by AI tools. And maybe I'm wrong on that premise, but that's how I approach it now.
The other, just if I can guess, Anne, the other interesting thing I found very similar to what you said is I like to ask a question about, especially when I'm new to a company, I like to ask a question in Gen Grid, and then I just look through it and I see, it labels kind of what call the quotes are coming from. And whatever call, often one call will have the most quotes popping up. I'll be like, oh, that call is the call most likely to answer the question that I am asking. So I don't have to read 20, if I want something specific on the Salesforce, I don't have to read through, if there's 20 transcripts, 6 of them till I find, oh, here's the one that really talks about Salesforce. It's just there. And that might sound obvious, but oftentimes it's not obvious when you're like just looking at the overall or anything. I found that's been a great way to really speed up what I want to focus on in one thing. Let me ask, go ahead.
Can I talk about deep research a little bit, feature?
Yeah, please.
Because I mentioned that in passing, but I think it's very much worth paying attention. So this is how I mostly use the deep research feature. Imagine I got an idea from somewhere. It may be a screen, it may be Andrew's podcast, yet another value podcast. Please go and subscribe. It can be a peer in my network who shared with me an interesting thesis. Whatever the source is. I believe, so my old process would be go read 10K or go read several earnings calls and conference call presentations such as Morgan Stanley TMT or JP Morgan Healthcare, whatever the case could be. And I slowly build a mosaic in my head. And it's at that point, even after reading those 5-8 calls, it's far from perfect because I'm trying to really put different pieces into their places. Who is the customer base? What's the segmentation? What's the pricing? It's slow. Plus corporate history, etc. Now, I also believe, and this is second input for what I'm going to say as a conclusion, is that think about this as reading books. If you read a book first and then you reread it 3 months later, you will probably get a lot deeper understanding of more intricate and complex concepts second time when you did the first time. I believe same applies to reading investment materials. If my mind is not prepared to absorb a lot of information and immediately put it into a lot of right places, and the right places here is the key, I will probably create a little bit mess in my head, and it will take me more time to sort it out. But how can I apply that concept of reading book first and then reading it 3 months later? Or a better analogy would be this. You got a great book recommendation. I would go and listen to a podcast with the author for an hour, get the key concepts, and say, okay, my mind is prepared. And then I will go and read the entire book. And my level of comprehension and retention will be a lot higher. Same with here in investing, what I'm trying to replicate. I have a prompt. I have a few prompts I will use for deep research feature. And it's a pretty long prompt, probably 5 pages. And I will ask AlphaSense Deep Research to return me a pretty detailed output, which will cover a lot of my questions. And then I will sit down, and usually print it out because that's how I like reading. I sit down in my reading chair, get a pencil, and go through that, highlighting, writing something on the margins, putting stars, exclamation marks, etc. It's probably usual output is 30, 40 pages would be my guess. Similarly, it will have great sources, all references to expert calls, or earnings calls, or conference calls, and then what Andrew said, then you can read those that most frequently cited. But after I read those 30 or 40 pages, my mind is prepared. It's an equivalent of listening to a podcast with an author for an hour before reading the entire 300 or 400 page book. And then I will go, and with prepared mind, I will start reading all those primary documents, or I will start with the most important ones. That's how I use deep research. Now, I also want to mention the new AI feature that I think just got shipped. And I have not even used it yet, but I'm very curious to use it. I think it's AI generated expert calls with experts. So it's AI asking questions. So I haven't got a chance to test those. It's got released very, very recently. So and with the earnings season happening right now, I didn't get a chance to try it, but I'm really curious.
Well, that actually brings me, I want to be cognizant of time because AlphaSense, it's an AlphaSense webinar. It's not my podcast where we can ramble for an hour. So, but that does bring me nicely to what I thought was going to be my last question, but maybe we'll make this the second to last question. Look, it's in the same way Bloomberg was, if anyone's had a Bloomberg trend, they're always releasing features, and everyone knows they only use like 5% of the Bloomberg features. AlphaSense is releasing features really quickly. I didn't even know about this expert AI transcript thing, and I use AlphaSense this AI talking to AI transcript. Maybe I haven't seen it. Maybe I wasn't on the beta. I don't know. But what have you found the best way to keep up with new tools? And look, with AI tools, many of them are much different than tools we've ever used before. So you get this new tool and you might think, oh, that's free. I don't know. And it might be the most powerful tool ever released. So how are you keeping up with, you can do AI broadly if you want, but I'd prefer, just because this is AlphaSense, but AlphaSense in particular, all the new features that they continuously roll out.
90 or maybe even 95% of what I know how to use AlphaSense, especially on the new features and new use cases, I've learned from account manager of Caro-Kann Capital, who is responsible for our account, and he's incredibly helpful. Amar Kapelian, shouting out to you. Thank you so much for teaching me everything, and I apologize for asking a bunch of dumb questions. So thank you for your patience. I've learned from my account manager. I will ask, I heard this feature is released. Could you show me how to use it? And also, because I've been working with Amar for a number of years, I think he got to know my investment style and what I do and what I don't want to do reasonably well. So he will point out, Artem, I think you will like this use case for this feature. I'm like, oh, that's great. I do. That's fantastic. So that's number one. Number two, sometimes I will ask Amar to spend 50 minutes with me on Zoom and just do a regular catch-up call, maybe every 6 months, maybe every 8 months. And I will be asking, like, hey, do you have any new things that you changed or improved or added or something? Could you show me? So that's another way for me to get up to speed and know what's changing there. So that's second. For example, Amar showed me how to use the grid and different use cases for expert calls or for earnings calls. And another cool feature for grid, you can, for example, let's say you cover 20 consumer good companies, and you're trying to figure out what they spoke about, macro, consumer confidence, whatever, right? You can pull it out into the grid. I don't do it as much because I'm not necessarily like the industry specialist, but it's another great use case.
I have found it's real because, look, every company, when they pull guidance or they miss guidance or they reduce guidance, let's say, what's the most common excuse? Consumer, the consumer soft. And I have found it really, really good. You read it, and most people do follow-up calls with management teams. Not all, but most people do follow-up calls with management team 24 hours, maybe 12 hours, maybe 12 minutes after the earnings call ends. And I found it so useful to be like, hey, this company said the consumer was soft during the quarter. What did here's XYZ, here's their 3 peers. What did they say? And then you get on the call with them and you say, hey, you guys said that it was soft. X, Y, and Z over there, all their results were better than yours. They said the consumer's strong. They said trends were soft. What is it about your company that the consumer is soft? Like, are you guys just using an excuse? Is there something about your specific consumer? And I found it's just so good. And again, that's something you can do on your own. But if you want to do that fast, you can't do that fast. It takes a lot of time, and it's great summary. And then again, if you want to dive into it, you can go and say, okay, X, Y, and Z, this is what the Gen Grid said. Let me go dive in and see specifically what they said. Last thing, again, we're running out of time. So I want to ask, you talk to your account manager a lot. You use AlphaSense a lot. What is something, I use AlphaSense a lot, and I know that I'm not using all their products properly. What is one thing that you're getting a lot of value out of AlphaSense that you think maybe the average user underutilizes, doesn't realize out there, anything? What's one AlphaSense tool that you think would recommend for that?
I don't necessarily know what a typical user may or may not be doing. So my best guess would be this. Over the years, I've spoken with a number of product managers who are responsible for building specific features. And now I'm talking about broad features like notebook product manager or some other like broad features, categories features, not small ones. And I've spoken with a number of them over the years. And I think it's also a great way to learn about the potential use cases and potential very powerful use cases, which may not be obvious to a user right away, from actually the people who were running the entire process, probably from ideating to building a prototype to testing to QA to quality assurance to shipping to users. That's probably the most knowledgeable planet on the person about that feature. So that's pretty cool. And also, and I'm hoping that was also a way that I was useful to those people who generously share their time, at least somewhat, at least a little bit, because it's also a way to get customers' voice. And sometimes you may say like, oh, do you think you can add this thing, this wrinkle? It will be really, really cool. And look, over the years, probably some of those thoughts from customers like me got implemented. I'm sure some thoughts from me may be too specific to my style and they're not relevant for many others, and they probably will be ignored, and it's totally fine. But some probably, I hope, would got into the program because few users like me would speak up about those things. So it's also, I hope I contributed a little bit and not just wasted people's time who are very, very busy with building the product. So, but that's probably my best answer. I'm not sure whether many other users of AlphaSense platform necessarily do that.
No, I think that's great. I certainly am not reaching out to the product manager specifically. So, okay, anyway, hey, I think we've run for a little bit over an hour, so I think we're really breaching the limits of what the AlphaSense webinar platform can handle. Artem Fokin from Caro-Kann Capital. I mean, both of us are power users. Both of us are happy users. Thanks for hopping on this podcast and discussing all things AI, expert calls, AlphaSense, not AlphaSense, everything. It's really fun, and we will have to chat soon.
Okay, talk soon. Bye, Andrew.
Everybody. A quick disclaimer, nothing on this podcast should be considered investment advice. Guests or the hosts may have positions in any of the stocks mentioned during this podcast. Please do your own work and consult a financial advisor. Thanks.